Summary of Mrs. Warren's Profession by George Bernard Shaw. Act I takes place in a garden that is located outside of a rural home. This property is rented by Vivie Warren, who is an ambitious, self-assured, and well-educated recent college graduate. Mr. Prade, a friend of her mother's who is interested in art, approaches Vivie. Vivie is good at math and tells Prade she wants to live a realistic life, going into business with her friend Ania Fraser and working in law, insurance, and finance. Prade says that everyone should appreciate art, but Vivie says that she has been to shows and museums with artists and was boring. She asks Prade if he thinks her mother will be okay with it. She tells him that she has never lived with her mother and doesn't know much about her. Prade won't say much about Vivie's mother to Vivie. Vivie thinks that her mother might try to control her life, but she says that she will use her mother's secretiveness about her own life against her in any fight they have about Vivie's future. Mrs. Kitty Warren, who is loud and dresses wildly, and Sir George Crofts, a rich middle-aged playboy, come. Vivie goes into the small house. Prade tells Mrs. Warren that Vivie seems grown and that she should treat her with respect. Mrs. Warren laughs at the idea that she doesn't know how to care for her own daughter. Mrs. Warren leaves the two men alone, and Crofts asks Prade if he knows who Vivie's dad is. He says he likes Vivie, but he can't be sure he's not her father. Prade says he doesn't know anything about that part of Mrs. Warren's life, but since Crofts is old enough to be Vivie's father, he should treat her like a parent. Crofts goes inside, and an old friend named Frank Gardner greets Prade. Frank is 20 years old and looks good and is smart. He tells Prade that he doesn't have any money and is living at home to save it, and that Vivie loves him. Prade asks Frank to tea, but as Frank is walking into the house, his father, the Reverend Samuel Gardner, calls to him. Reverend Gardner is a haughty, loud-mouthed person who is crazy about being respected. He wants to know what the people in the house do for a living before he will go into their yard. Frank tells him that Vivie Warren owns the house and that he wants to get married to her. He says that Vivie is smart and has money, but he has neither. Reverend Gardner thinks it's hard to believe that anyone has enough money to help Frank. Reverend Gardner told Frank a story about how he acted when he was young. He said that he once offered a lover £50 to buy back his letters to her so that he could destroy proof of their affair. Frank's father meets Vivie outside, and Vivie then calls for Mrs. Warren to come outside. Reverend Gardner is shocked to see Mrs. Warren because he knows him. She says she still has the letters he sent her. Act 2 happens that night inside the house. After a walk at night, Mrs. Warren and Frank are the first ones to get back. Frank flirts with Mrs. Warren and she kisses him, but then says she meant it as a motherly gesture. Frank tells her that he likes Vivie. Crofts and Reverend Gardner walk in, and Mrs. Warren asks where Prade is in a hurry. Frank says that he and Vivie must enjoy going for walks alone at night. Crofts and the Reverend Gardner don't want Frank to date Vivie. Mrs. Warren says she doesn't see any reason why the two young people shouldn't get married. However, when she finds out that Frank doesn't have much money, she says it's impossible for him to marry her daughter. Frank says that he will try to win Vivie's love, even though older people have told him not to. When Vivie and Prade arrive, the older people eat dinner in the small kitchen. Vivie and Frank make fun of older people. Vivie says she never wants to live a life of laziness and lack of purpose like theirs, while Frank says he wants to be lazy, but in style. He tries to get Vivie's attention, but she turns him down. When Vivie and Frank go to the kitchen to get something to eat, Mrs. Warren and Crofts come in. Mrs. Warren says that she doesn't like the way Crofts is looking at Vivie. He tells Mrs. Warren that he wants to marry Vivie and says that not many other men would want Mrs. Warren as a mother-in-law. Mrs. Warren doesn't like the idea at all. Crofts offers to give her a check on the day of the wedding and to leave all of his money to Vivie when he dies. He storms out of the house when Mrs. Warren attacks him. Soon after that, the Gardners leave, bringing Prade and Crofts with them to stay with them at their house. When Mrs. Warren is alone with Vivie, she tells her that she thinks Frank is a waste of time and that Vivie shouldn't try to get him to date her. Vivie agrees, and she also says that Crofts seems like a useless person. Mrs. Warren is surprised by how confident Vivie is, and she tells Vivie that she will have to see Crofts often because he is a friend of hers. Vivie asks her mother if she thinks they will spend a lot of time together in the future. She says she doesn't think Mrs. Warren will like the way she lives. Mrs. Warren is upset by Vivie's independence, so she says that she will decide how Vivie lives. Vivie wants to know who her mother is and who her father is. She also wants to know why her mother has the right to tell her what to do with her life. Mrs. Warren tells her that Crofts is not her father, but she won't tell her who is or say anything else about herself. Vivie says they should go to bed because they have hit a dead end. Mrs. Warren says that Vivie doesn't care about other people and is a bad daughter. Vivie says she wants to be treated with care and will accept her mother's choices about her life in return. Mrs. Warren laughs at the idea that she had any choices and chooses to tell Vivie about her life. Mrs. Warren tells Vivie that she is one of 4 daughters of a woman who never got married and took lovers to take care of her 4 children. One of Mrs. Warren's half-sisters died of lead poisoning from working in a factory, and the other married a drinker and lived in poverty. Liz, her older sister, ran away from school. Years later, when Mrs. Warren was working in a bar for long hours and low pay, the 2 sisters ran into each other again. Liz was a prostitute, and she told her sister that she should do the same. She gave Mrs. Warren money to get a job, and in the end, the 2 of them opened a chain of brothels all over Europe. Liz is now a decent woman from the top class. Mrs. Warren explains why she went into sex work by saying that it was the only way for a woman like her to make a good living. She says that upper-class women try to marry rich men, but lower-class women can only hope to sell their bodies for sex. However, she also says that marriage and sex work are very similar in the end. Even though she knows she should be ashamed of what she does, she is proud of herself for keeping her self-respect and running her business as well. Vivie likes how tough and honest her mother is. Before they say goodbye, Vivie promises to be kind to her mother. Mrs. Warren blesses her daughter, and they hug. Act 3 happens the next morning in the yard outside of Reverend Gardner's home and place of work, the rectory. Reverend Gardner goes outside to meet his son. He has a headache because he stayed up late with Crofts telling shocking stories, and he can't remember much about the night before. Frank tells his father that he told Crofts to bring the Warrens to the house. Reverend Gardner is shocked to hear that people with questionable morals will be coming to his home. When Prade walks in, he and Frank see Crofts, Mrs. Warren, and Vivie coming toward them. Frank doesn't like seeing a mother and daughter walking together. When the guests come, Frank asks his dad to take them to the church. Once he and Vivie are alone, he asks her why she was hugging her mother. Vivie says that she now gets her mom. Frank says that he can see that Mrs. Warren is a bad person, while Vivie can't. He tells Vivie in a flirtatious way that she shouldn't move in with her mother because it would ruin their time together. Vivie is quickly hypnotized by him. Crofts walks up to Vivie and asks to talk to her alone. Frank leaves, but he tells Vivie that if she rings a bell in the yard, he will come back. Crofts asks Vivie out in a very unromantic way. He tells her that he is rich, knows how to get what he wants, and will leave her his money when he dies. When Vivie says no, he says that he was a good friend to Vivie's mother because he gave her the money she needed to start her own business. Vivie is surprised because she thought her mom had finished the business. Crofts laughs at this, saying that closing down a business that is doing so well would be stupid. Crofts says that the business they are talking about is a chain of bars in Brussels and Ostend, but Vivie says that she knows what the business is really about. Crofts curses Mrs. Warren for telling Vivie, and then he says that everyone in the top class makes money from businesses that take advantage of people. He says that Vivie has always gotten her money from prostitutes. Vivie feels bad about what she did and tries to leave, but Crofts stops her. She rings the doorbell, and Frank comes over with a gun. Crofts tells Vivie and Frank that they are both the children of Reverend Gardner because he doesn't like them. When Vivie gets mad, she points Frank's gun at herself, which makes him drop it. Vivie runs away and tells Frank that she is going to London to visit her friend Honoria Fraser. Act 4 takes place at Fraser and Warren's office in London, where Vivie now works. Frank comes to see Vivie to figure out what their relationship is like. Vivie says that she doesn't want to be anything other than his sister. Frank thinks this means she has a new boyfriend, but Vivie says it's not true. Praed comes to say goodbye to Vivie before leaving for Italy. He says that he wishes he could get her to travel and see the beauty of the world. But when he talks about Brussels, Vivie is shocked. She tells Praed and Frank what her mother really does for a living. Both of them are shocked. Vivie goes to the next room to calm down, and Frank tells Praed that he won't try to marry her anymore because he can't take money from prostitutes. Mrs. Warren comes in, and she looks very worried. After Frank writes a note for Vivie, Praed and Frank leave. Vivie gave her income back to her mother's bank, and she says she plans to take care of herself from now on. Mrs. Warren tells Vivie how rich she is and how easy it is for her to buy Vivie a place in stylish, decent society. She says that she thought she and Vivie had everything figured out. Vivie asks her mom why she didn't quit the job when she had enough money to live on. Mrs. Warren says she needs work to keep her busy and explains that since someone will always do what she does, she isn't hurting anyone by keeping up her business. Vivie says that she doesn't like how her mother lives. Mrs. Warren curses Vivie, saying that she stole her schooling and now won't do what a daughter should do. She walks away without shaking Vivie's hand. Vivie sits down at her desk, breathes a sigh of relief, and gets to work.
About the author. Dublin is where George Bernard Shaw was born. At age 20, Shaw moved from Dublin to London, where he spent his 20s trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He lived with his mother and got odd writing jobs with the help of his friend Lee. In the middle of the 1880s, Shaw became a committed socialist. He wrote the statement for the Fabian Society, a socialist group that wanted to slowly adopt socialist ideas instead of trying to overthrow capitalism all at once. Shaw lost his virginity to an older woman in the late 1880s. After that, he stayed mostly single for the rest of his life. During this time, he also began to do well as a reviewer, playwright, and author. Arms and the Man, which was put on in 1894, was Shaw's first well-known play. In 1898, when Shaw's career was taking off, he had a health scare. The woman who helped him get better married him, but it is thought that they never actually got together. Shaw went on to write more than 60 plays and became the most respected moral authority of the first half of the 20th century. He had an opinion on every major topic in British politics.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.